Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kishore Mahbubani. I'm the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. It gives me great pleasure to invite you to this panel discussion. As usual, when I speak as Dean, I'll make 3 points. And my first point, of course, is to emphasize the importance of trade to Singapore. I think, as you know, we have the highest trade dependency ratio of any country in the world. I think it's 3.5 times the size of our GNP. And fortunately for Singapore, global trade continues to grow and grow. And indeed, the more global trade grows, the better off Singapore is, and therefore it's rather appropriate that we should focus on the subject of trade also. And all this brings me to my second point, which is the topic that we have chosen today, which you can tell is slightly provocative, is the transatlantic trade agreement driven by a fear of Asia. And I think you will find a healthy exchange of views among the panel. Some of us believe, with obvious justification, that trade is driven by trade considerations and maybe economic considerations. I belong to a different point of view as someone who's lived my life in geopolitics. I also believe that quite often trade, and especially trade agreements, are also driven by geopolitical considerations. And the 2 examples I would mention, for example, I happened to be present, fortunately, at the first ever APEC leaders meeting that was held in Blake Island in 1993, November 1993. President Bill Clinton chaired the meeting. And if you go back and check the records, I believe that it was, in many ways, the fear of Asia-Pacific coming together that led Europe to agree to the completion of the Uruguay round subsequently. There's some data, some information on that that's also available. So that's one example. The second example, of course, is the proliferation of trade agreements in this region. As you know, China has signed a free trade agreement with Southeast Asia, with ASEAN. And while that trade agreement may have been driven by trade and economic considerations, I think it also helped to protect China geopolitically because it ensured that there could be no containment policy against China when its neighbors become interdependent with China. But these are just some examples, and I'm sure during the Q&A we will have a very interesting discussion. I say we'll have an interesting discussion just so that you know why I'm confident we'll have an interesting discussion, is that we had a preview when the 2 panelists, Ambassador Susan Schwab and Professor Victor Halberstadt and I, were interviewed in my office for a Channel News Asia program that will appear at 9 o'clock tonight. And you will see the interesting differences of view emerge in that program, and you see it emerging here too. So all this brings me to my third and most important point, which is that to introduce the 2 panelists. And here we are very pleased to have 2 very distinguished members of the governing board of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy speak here at the school. And we are joined by some other equally distinguished members of the governing board, our chairman, Professor Wang Gangwu, and Mr. Paul Volcker, who's also here And I hope, Paul, you'll come in with your point of view also, because we will force you to choose. Ambassador Susan Schwab actually began her career in USTR in 1977 as a trade negotiator for agricultural policy issues. She moved on to the American Embassy in Tokyo, worked in Senator John Danforth's office, and she became the Director General of U.S. and Foreign Commercial Services in the Department of Commerce. She, as you also know, she was also the U.S. Trade Representative during the Bush administration, and in that capacity, of course, was involved in many significant negotiations. And I can tell you that she brings to this panel, I think, the greatest depth of expertise on trade issues of any one of us here on this panel. She also holds a PhD in Public Administration and International Business from the George Washington University, an MA in Development Policy from Stanford University, and a BA in Political Economy from Williams College. She's also been a former dean, so we're very happy that we have someone who's been involved in both the policy and academia world with us. Professor Victor Halberstadt is equally distinguished. Right now, he's an international advisor of Goldman Sachs, professor of public sector economics at Leiden University, and a faculty member of the World Economic Forum. He began his academic career as a senior lecturer of public finance at the University of Amsterdam in 1965 and became a professor in the theory of public finance in 1974. He served as a consultant, the Director General of the National Budget in the Dutch Ministry of Finance. But he has held many, many distinguished international appointments. He was Honorary Secretary General of the Bilderberg Conference from 1980 to 2000. And then he also served as the Queen's Informator for coalition government in 1981. He was president of the International Institute of Public Finance, and in 1990 he was appointed Knight of the Order of the Netherlands Lion. He also served for many years as chairman of the Daimler Chrysler Advisory Board, and I believe among the members of the advisory board were some former presidents, prime ministers, and all that. So you including Paul Volcker. So you can share with us later who was on your distinguished members of your board. So we are truly blessed to have this distinguished panel. We're going to start off with a few introductory points, comments from Professor Halberstadt. Then he'll be followed by Professor Schwab. Each will speak for about 5 or 10 minutes. And then I hope that my role is quite simple. I'll be the agent provocateur, and we'll get a good discussion going. So thank you very much. With that, Professor Halberstadt.
Thank you, Kishore. Very kind. Has weakened my position, what you've just said. It's a bit Yogi Berra talking about transatlantic free trade alliances or compacts or whatever that's between the European Union and the United States. It is, as Yogi Berra said, it's déjà vu all over again. We have been through this for the past few decades a number of times. In the 90s, the Clinton administration, in the Bush administration, and the last effort was in 2007, probably Susan knows more about it, when we even established a special counsel for it. So the question is, why do we want to do this now again? Why do we want to establish a more of a trade alliance between the European Union and the US as compared to the current situation? Well, the reason is very simple. We are each other's most important trading partner. In addition, we are the most important investor in each other's regions. Stock of investment of like $1.5 trillion for the US and Europe, and similarly the Europeans in the US. And both economies, the European Union and the US economies, could do very well with a set of supply-side actions. But why do it now? Obviously, there are many reasons. I can think of 10 or 11 why we are starting new negotiations now, as have been announced by President Obama and by the European Commission. A very important one, I should say at the outset, is that world trade is changing in structure. Susan Schwab may talk about this in more detail because she knows it so much better, but basically supply chains are changing dramatically, and therefore value added is very different from what it looks like if you look only at global trade numbers. And as part of that, there is a real need for a redesign of some of the current arrangements which we have in various countries too. The United States and Europe together account for around a third of world GDP. Can be measured differently, but this is a very sizable part. And as we are going through a period of a fairly large number of free trade agreements or partnerships, as we are currently going, there was this meeting last week, Singapore, the Pacific arrangement, there have been the Korean arrangements with the United States, with ASEAN, with us, with the Europeans. So there are a few dozen free trade arrangements which all require to think about the fact whether we are going to have more free trade arrangements, regional ones, or are we going to have a large multilateral one? And that brings me immediately to the fourth argument, which is that we have been struggling in the past decade or so with the Doha round, which was the next round after the Uruguay round. Last time we reached an agreement was 1993. And the Doha round is in limbo, to put it friendly, and therefore there have been all these regional trade agreements, and the Europeans and the North Americans think that it may be a good idea to be part of that. And then there are a few other considerations for us to want to do it now. One, protectionism has largely been absent in this economic recession of the past 4 or 5 years. That's very encouraging. In fact, global trade has grown. It has grown faster than world output since 2010. And that in itself is a good reason to try to see whether there is more upside potential. And that brings me to the core, and then probably Ambassador Schwab can elaborate on that. The core is that I believe that these negotiations will be about lowering tariffs, but there isn't that much to lower because we have very low tariffs between the European Union and the US, on average 3-4%. There may be a little bit of upside potential there, but there isn't that much going to come out of that. But very important are non-tariff barriers, regulations, licenses, government procurement. I mean, there's a whole set of arrangements on both sides of the Atlantic which, if tackled, if brought back, if diminished, would add considerably to GDP on both sides of the Atlantic. And that, I think, explains, those two things explain why we are going for these negotiations at this time. But there's another reason which relates to the title, and that's where I'll stop, Kishore, to the title which you gave provocatively, the geopolitical title you gave to this panel, which is that obviously if the Europeans and the North Americans, the US, can get their act together on a whole set of these non-tariff barrier issues, then we may be able to play a major role or dominate the negotiations which are surely coming up in multilateral negotiations as we go forward. All of this is not about the short run. I believe that I differ with some here where I think that there is not going to be a short-term impulse of this for the economy. This is not about GDP in 2014 or 15. This is about long-term supply-side actions where I think both the Europeans and the Americans, and by the way, the rest of the world, is in dire need of.
Thank you. Great start. Is this working? Yeah. Okay, Susan, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I guess I start with a sort of a general comment, which is as a recovering trade negotiator, these.
I thought you can never recover from it.
I'm not sure you can. These kinds of trade agreements, just as an observation, are too difficult to negotiate to do them just for geopolitical reasons, just because you want to put out a happy press release. So I guess I would, for nice diplomatic niceties, they're too hard to negotiate. So at the end of the day, you have to have some pretty good reasons, economic reasons, to get them get them underway and to get them done. And as Victor stated, these negotiations, they're referred to as the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP. They are promising to be very tough. And if the US and the EU can pull them off, and this is a big if, I would note, I think you would agree. If they can, they promise to be very significant in their outcome. But the motivation is largely economic in nature, not a reaction to Asia or a fear of Asia. And I would note the fact that the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations are several years ahead of the TTIP is an indication of that. If you need to look no farther. What are the motivations for negotiating this kind of a trade agreement, though? And I think there are a number of them, and they bear looking at as you start thinking about the contents of this kind of trade agreement. One, the obvious market access. Now, classical economists would tell you that you shouldn't have to wait for a trade agreement to open your markets. That gets you to the second motivation for negotiating a trade agreement, which is domestic economic reforms. Domestic reforms, whether it's regulatory or other reforms, and again, trade is sort of the marriage of economics, classical economics, and real-world politics. So on the market access side, yes, the consumer benefits from unilateral market opening, and yes, there are countries like Singapore that manage to do it on their own, but most of the rest of us have relied on negotiations with other countries where you leverage the opening of others' markets as an excuse to open your own. And similarly, you use negotiations where you undertake domestic economic reforms, and here I'm thinking about some of the agreements involving trade practices such as the elimination of subsidies to manufactured exports, the disciplining of agricultural subsidies. These are all parts of WTO and previously GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade agreements, that members of the WTO should have done on their own unilaterally because they're the smart things to do, but by negotiating them as part of a trade agreement, they were easier to do politically. So again, motivations: one, market access, being able to sort of the mercantilist motivation; two, the motivation to self-impose domestic reforms. Three, and I think the TTIP is a very, very good example of this, wanting to set precedents. As Victor noted, the US and the EU have been tremendously frustrated, as has Singapore, as have a number of market-oriented, free trade-oriented countries in the Asia-Pacific region, with the stalling of multilateral trade negotiations in the WTO, the Doha round. The Doha round has been underway since 2001, and depending on how you look at the clock, it first stalled out in 1999 in Seattle, arguably. So the WTO negotiations, the last time we had a major multilateral trade agreement concluded was 1993, 1994 with the Uruguay round. And a great deal has happened since then, and countries and governments have come up with ingenious ways of blocking trade since then, in the nooks and crannies, the gaps of the GATT and WTO agreements. And let's face it, there are products and services that exist today that we couldn't even dream of in 1993, 1994, that are being blocked every day. And so setting precedents in these kinds of trade negotiations, and this is a motivation of the TPP as well, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, setting precedents in these, quote, 21st century agreements that can then, one hopes, be migrated into future negotiations, future, we hope, multilateral trade negotiations is another motivation. And then finally, competitiveness, and you can define competitiveness any number of ways. My definition would be, if you can meet the competition in a third country market and another market before the competition shows up in your home market, as the U.S. auto industry learned to its chagrin, all the better. So just being able to be out there and compete, and those benefits that one derives from opening one's market, that is another potential benefit. So those are all parts of the motivation for negotiating TTIP, for entering into this negotiation. The U.S. currently has free trade agreements with 20 countries. In the case of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a number of those countries are involved in the TPP, and the TPP will be a matter of upgrading those agreements. But in the case of the Trans-Pacific, in the case of TTIP, this is a whole new ballgame, and it will be very, very interesting to see. And the kinds of new areas or dramatically upgraded elements of those negotiations, I'll just mention a few. Victor mentioned a number, and then I'll stop so we can launch into conversation and Q's and A's. Services, the WTO takes a very, very light treatment of services. At the WTO, there is a new services negotiation, or in parallel with the WTO. 16 countries have launched an international services agreement negotiation. We'll see how that goes, but you can bet that TTIP will involve the transatlantic negotiation, just as the TPP involves much more comprehensive services negotiations. Intellectual property is another area. Investment. Yes, there's a very deep stock, dramatic flows of investment across the Atlantic at present time, but all of the U.S. investment agreements are with individual member states. And I think post-Lisbon Treaty, now the Commission, right? The EU Commission has the responsibility for investment, and the U.S. doesn't have an agreement with the EU per se. Regulations, the EU is all about regulations, and ideally the transatlantic deal will result in a simplification of those regulations rather than the U.S. adopting the complexity of the EU's regulations. Trade facilitation and supply chains, if anyone wants to get into that, I'd love to talk about that. There's some very, very interesting new studies that have just been released in January and February. Competition policy is another area. So these are examples of areas that have not been treated in the depth that they could and should be treated, potentially in multilateral agreements, and we'll see these increasingly in the new, quote, 21st century trade agreements.
Great. Can I actually, I suspect some members in the audience were slightly puzzled when you used the expression TTIP. So I was going to ask you, can you explain to them why the Obama administration decided to call it TTIP rather than TAFTA? You explained that to me earlier, so why? The choice of acronym
right?
is very interesting, by the way.
I see cameras here. Nomenclature. So here's the deal. Nomenclature is really important here. And once upon a time, there was a guy by the name of Ross Perot. And the first trade agreement, major trade agreement that the U.S. negotiated was a U.S.-Canada free trade agreement. And then the first really big one was NAFTA, North America Free Trade Agreement. And it is an exceptionally important regional trade agreement. And unfortunately, in our presidential campaign in the early 90s, an independent candidate for president by the name of Ross Perot campaigned against NAFTA and is quoted famously as referring to the giant sucking sound of jobs going to Mexico. And ever since then, the polling data, public opinion polls, have polled negatively against NAFTA. And so any trade agreement that has an acronym that sounds like AFTA polls negatively in the United States. So politicians try to avoid, and administrations try to avoid any trade agreement that has that acronym. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, but it's interesting how politics influences it all.
Is that pathetic or what?
Okay, one more question before I throw the floor open to the audience here. It's quite obvious that there's some really difficult. Wait, one's warm, one's cold. Choose the cold one. There are some very difficult issues, in this one, in the negotiations. One is, of course, agriculture. So I was going to ask first Victor, and then you, Susan. How are you going to solve this agriculture problem? And explain to them what the agriculture problem is.
How do we solve the agriculture
I mean, in theory,
problem?
you should all be very happy to have. Let me just say something that is politically incorrect here. So don't quote me on this, okay?
You're in front of the cameras, Kishore.
I think. You know what? I find it when I say that people listen. No, Singapore is one of the biggest beneficiaries of agricultural subsidies. You know, there they are, all these countries subsidizing agriculture, so we get cheap butter, cheap milk coming here. So, from our selfish point of view, you should carry on subsidizing. But from the global point of view, subsidies are no good. So, how do you explain this subsidies problem to everyone, Victor, then Susan? And how do you solve this problem?
I can explain it, I cannot solve it. The explanation is in two words: the parliamentary democracy and lobbies. That's the explanation. And the solution has got to be characterized by these same two words. Because take the case of the Europeans, but I could take the American case too. Take the case of the Europeans. We spent the largest part of the European budget
on agricultural subsidies.
On agricultural subsidies.
How much roughly?
It's very sizable. I don't have the number for today.
By the way, that's sorry to interrupt you. My friend Shashi Tharu, who was an Indian minister, said you could fly every European cow first class around the world twice on the money that each cow got.
Perhaps on the charter flight, yes. The truth of the matter is that the agricultural industries in both the US and the European Union have traditionally been extraordinarily effective. And in the case of Europe, let me confine myself to that, just remind ourselves that the first industry after the coal and steel production, which we really harmonized, was agricultural, the common agricultural policy in the 50s. And that has led to a structure of the agriculture industry which has made that industry extraordinarily efficient, and its lobbies very effective, and its claim on the treasury very sizable. We have been unable, much like Japan, by the way, has been unable in agriculture, we have been unable to bring back the size of the agricultural subsidies and that has been a major obstacle in our negotiations in WTO and now in the relationship with the United States. On the other hand, I'm encouraged by what happened last week in Japan. Remember, Japan, for all those years, did not want to join the TPP, the Pacific Partnership, largely because of the agricultural lobbies.
Yes.
And yes, last week the new government said that they would try to take that risk, understand that this is against the interest of the agricultural industries, but that they will do their very best, nevertheless, to negotiate, and for the first time ever are joining you, for which they must have a very, very good reason. So I have noted that in Europe, the resistance in the past 2 months of the agricultural lobbies has been weaker and meeker than we have seen in many years, because they probably understand that they should not stand in the way of a more efficient solution.
Great. Susan, do you share his optimism that agricultural opposition is diminishing?
Oh, I think it's always tough. I learned, you noted that my first job out of graduate school, and I regret that my bio includes what year it was, was as an agricultural trade negotiator, and it was in that job that I was informed that every state in the United States has 2 cows and at least 2 senators and at least 2 cows. and
the 2 senators are slightly more important.
But you just learn the incredible political clout that the agricultural lobby has. Agricultural subsidies. Let's take agricultural subsidies, and then let's take import protection, because you've got 2, and then there's a third element, which is the EU. The real problems that the U.S. has with the EU has to do with regulations, but the SPS, the sanitary, phytosanitary issues, GMO, GMOs, genetically modified, agricultural biotechnology. Again, nomenclature, right? Nomenclature. In the case of agricultural subsidies, export subsidies, there is an example where you really need a functioning multilateral trading system, a WTO and WTO negotiations that work, because this isn't something that the U.S. and the EU are going to do on their own. It's something that Brazil, for example, in a multilateral setting, at some point, Argentina, Brazil, Australia, will force out of the U.S. and the EU. And the Doha round, on the table, the U.S. and the EU had very significant commitments on the table. And it's unfortunate that those did not ultimately materialize in a Doha round outcome. But the Doha round is dead. So
just tell them what the commitments were. Many people may not know what the commitments that you put on the table were.
It's not public.
Oh, it's not public yet.
Well, it's public, but it's not.
Officially,
I'm not talking about what I put on the table. Let's put it that way. But I mean, significant. Do you really want? I mean, this is really wonky stuff. You really want to get into this?
Yeah. Because I think people. I'm trying to draw the complexity of these trade negotiations. You know?
Okay, so I'll spare you well, I'll give you a taste of it. There's the ceiling on the current ceiling on overall U.S. agricultural export subsidies is something on the order of $48 billion. The EU ceiling is 3 times that. Actual U.S. agricultural export subsidies for the years we were negotiating were closer to about $20 billion. It's now below 12, I think. We had on the table at the time 18 or 19, which was a dramatic commitment. When I say on the table, an offer to lower the ceiling from 48 to 18 or 19. And then within that, you've got these issues. You've got red box, amber box, blue box. you don't want to know. But I mean, it has to do, you get into this really odd kind of negotiation about, and here you've got policy, these are policy students for the most part. Here's a challenge for you. What you're trying to do when you're negotiating agricultural subsidies, obviously, is to minimize the negative impact on your trading partners, right? So if you think about this, a subsidy that will minimize the negative impact on your trading partners is the subsidy that delinks prices and quantity, correct? Right? So it's a subsidy to the farmer that doesn't have any kind of a link between the quantity that he or she produces and the price, the market price. Are you following me? Okay. Well, what that means...
It might be easier if you give a concrete example, like, let's say, grain, wheat, sugar, whatever it is.
Oh, dear.
Just illustrate 1 kilogram, sort of, this is the impact.
Okay, well, let me try it a little differently. If Victor is a wheat farmer...
Yeah.
Which I am, yeah.
If Victor is a wheat farmer, if I tell Victor, this is not going to do it. This is not going to do it.
You get a sense of the complexity.
If I pay Victor,
money to produce and money not to produce.
Money, regardless of whether he produces or not, he is not going to flood the world market with cheap wheat. Therefore, it's not going to drive the world market price down. Okay, that's what I mean by delinking price and
quantity.
volume.
Yeah.
Right? Except that if you're a politician, and this was the reaction, so that's a green box subsidy. That's considered a green box subsidy because you've delinked the two, which is what you should do if you want to be considerate to your trading partner, right? Except if you're a US politician or you're President Bush and you're listening to your trade representative describe a green box subsidy, your reaction is, you're telling me I have to convince the United States Congress to pay Victor whether he plants something or not? Like I'm going to hand Victor a check whether he plants something or not, regardless of what the market price is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
So you get the point. It's very
complicated. It's totally different than our farm bill is, our farm, U.S. farm program, because you want to pay Victor if he plants. Well, if I pay Victor if he plants, then he's going to just keep planting and planting and planting, and we have to do something with that wheat. So we ship the wheat out, and it drives down the world price, and that hurts, right? Anyway, so you get you get the picture. So it gets pretty complicated, but you would think that at this point in time, with global commodity prices as high as they are, this would be a great time to negotiate this kind of an agreement. And unfortunately, nobody's at the table in Geneva negotiating these kinds of agreements. Enough said about that.
Okay, Victor, you have anything to add before I throw the floor?
Well, just let me give
How did we get off on that tangent?
No, because it's important to explain how complicated these negotiations are, actually.
Well, here's something about trade negotiating. Any of you, if you get into trade negotiating, here's the good news and the bad news. If you are really serious about negotiating trade agreements, you get to do both the ridiculous and the sublime, okay? You get to pontificate about big, important issues, and you also need to understand
the details.
The details. If you take, for example, BSE beef, the distillilium and the spinal cord, if you take those two things out, then the beef is safe, right? I mean, you need to you do the sublime and the ridiculous, and then you get to be a trade negotiator.
Victor?
Well, I've never been so lucky as to be a trade negotiator.
You did advise Mike Moore for many years.
I was for many years the advisor to Mike Moore, Director General of the WTO. I think it basically all boils down to trying to understand not general statements about it, but specifics. One of the specific examples which I find mind-boggling is that, just sticking to agriculture, or agriculture-related product, on food and beverages. Imports from the US, so the US exporting to Europe, faces an extra cost of like 60% of one kind of tariff or other. This is not regulation, it's simply tariffs. And exports to the US face a tariff of altogether 70%. And this is basically what it is about as far as I'm concerned. If you can simplify these things, you can bring them down, that is helpful to the economy on both sides. And this applies worldwide. This is what these multilateral trade negotiations have been about. And there are people in the room who have witnessed it, like myself, for many, many decades. Obviously, when you compare the world of 2013 or the position of Singapore 2013 or of the Netherlands 2013, where we were in 1963 or 1993 in world trade, then world trade has become very, very liberalized. But there's a long way to go, and this discussion which we are having about a European-American trade relationship and the one which you are having in the Pacific is really about setting steps, taking some supply-side actions to free up these economies going forward.
The floor is open now.
I agree with Susan Schwab that I think the primary motivation is economic. Of course, there are geopolitical factors in the background, as there always are in trade negotiations, but there is a huge amount of bread and butter involved, especially when it comes to regulatory issues. I've got two questions for the two of you. The first really concerns the nature of a possible agreement. Now, the EU and the US say they aim for high standard, deep integration agreements that go deep into non-border regulatory barriers, especially the United States. If they are successful in doing that, do you think it might change the equation here in Asia? Because almost without exception, Asian and other developing country FTAs are trade light. Some of them tackle the tariffs, but they hardly tackle the really important stuff, and they have minimal impact on trade and growth. So if we end up with a successful TTIP, and of course a TPP, might it actually change the nature of intra-Asian FTAs? That's one question. My second question is really taking Susan's bait on global value chains, so-called, which are the name of the game in real-world international trade, if not in trade negotiations. This is where trade is really increasing fast in both manufacturing and services. What impact might a successful TTIP have on global value chains? And that, of course, will have huge implications for this part of the world as well.
The global value chain question, I think there's a, well, first of all, let me start on the first question. I would argue the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, in a way is further along and could make a bigger difference even than the transatlantic negotiation. There's some interesting, some of the interesting areas being contemplated as part of the TPP, such as state-owned enterprises. You know, how do you deal with state-owned enterprises? As you know, it's not a matter of getting rid of state-owned enterprises. It's, you know, the concept of competitive neutrality. How does a state-owned or state-supported enterprise compete with a private sector entity? You know, how do you create a level playing field? Some of those precedents could be very, very significant. Some of the precedents having to do with big data, having to do with e-commerce. So I think they can, those are supposed to, in theory, TPP is supposed to be completed by the end of 2013. The TTIP, we're talking about the end of 2014. So some of these precedents we could well see in Asia before we see them in the transatlantic deal. On supply chains, just a couple of thoughts. the two studies, and obviously you're very familiar with these.
But the audience doesn't know.
The recent studies that have come out, one a WTO OECD study that, for example, said that if you look at the value added, if you look at trade flows and the value added component, for example, the U.S.-China trade deficit would shrink by 25%. And for those of you who are interested, and I suspect those of you who study trade policy are aware of these studies, and if you're not, they're fascinating studies available on the web. There are a couple of studies on the iPod. They're put out by a group, PCIC. Can't even remember what it's in San Diego. I can't even remember what PCIC stands for. My head is all congested. But anyway, iPod, just sort of illustrative. $300 iPod sells for $300 in the United States. It shows up on the U.S. books as a $150 import from China. It's got $4 of Chinese value added in it. You know, by the time you look at the pieces that have come from Korea, the pieces that have come from India, the pieces that have come from Taiwan, you do those calculations. It is truly fascinating. So that's one piece of it. If you look at the trade facilitation infrastructure side of the supply chain picture, you realize that facilitating imports is as important as facilitating exports, and the World Bank, World Economic Forum, Bain's study that came out shortly after the WTO OECD study, that tells you that if you could get the world to move up to half of the level of best practices, you could get almost a 5% boost in global GDP. Victor tells me that those are pretty rigorous. Those are pretty rigorous studies. I just looked at the punchlines, and they're pretty astonishing punchlines. Very, very dramatic. Even if you could get half of that. One nice point to note, to the extent that there's anything left of the Doha round, there is some glimmer that in Bali in December at the WTO ministerial, the trade facilitation piece of the Doha round could possibly be resuscitated when the ministers meet in December in Bali. And that is the piece left. It's the only piece that was really going to add value anyway, other than, for example, some of the, we talked about agricultural subsidies and a few others. It's possible that there could be agreement on the trade facilitation piece. And given this study, I would hope that would bolster the chances.
But his first question was whether or not these agreements would have an impact on the trade light agreements in Asia.
Well, TPP is an Asian agreement.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an Asia-Pacific
agreement. I think
agreement.
it's referring more to the ones within
about 300.
China.
Oh, okay.
China
well,
and ASEAN.
TPP.
And ASEAN, Japan, Australia, ASEAN. Are those trade light agreements?
Today there are, depending on how you count them, some 300 bilateral and regional trade agreements in the world today. If you look at the WTO website. Saying all this to Rezi and Sally is embarrassing because he knows all of this and more. So I'm sort of saying this to all of you because your professor knows all this stuff. Most of those are lousy quality agreements. Most of them are goods only, not services. And even though the WTO says you're not supposed to have bilateral or regional agreements that don't include substantially all trade, the definition of substantially all trade has sort of been lax. So you have a lot of low-quality agreements. It turns out it's really hard and rarely done that you take existing agreements and upgrade them. And so usually countries sort of start over. Interestingly, one of the things about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, when we conceived of the TPP in the Bush administration, even though it was launched in 2008, fall of 2008 before we left office, as we were designing it, in 2007, early 2007, I sat down with my counterparts in Canada and Mexico and said, here's a really interesting way of updating and upgrading that other trade agreement, the old one, whose acronym we don't use anymore.
Yeah. The unmentionable one.
That one. And so even though Canada and Mexico weren't part of the original TPP launch, they are now part of the TPP. So I think there may be a way of updating and upgrading, but the concept behind TPP is to make it an agreement that it has concentric circles. You can build it out, other countries can join it. But as you know, one of the visions behind APEC is to have, quote, FTAP, free trade area of the Asia Pacific, that could be APEC-wide at some point. And TPP could form the basis of that. Or you could start with a blank sheet of paper and you could draw from these different agreements. But yes, I would hope that it would be harder and harder for countries to negotiate low-quality agreements after a successful TPP was concluded. But first you have to conclude a successful TPP, and that hasn't been done yet.
Victor, you want to add anything on the global value chain? Or?
Well, no, but I'm just struck. World trade, global trade is so very, very important. We wouldn't be sitting here if there were no world trade. And you know what? Next month, or in 2 months, the WTO, World Trade Organization, will elect its next leader, which is much more important than what happened last week in 24 hours in Rome. That's what I'm throwing up for debate here. But I'm not inviting. Well, no, not for debate.
So I'm just giving you. Which region is he coming from, or she coming from?
There are 9 candidates.
But which region is the?
Oh, here, largely Latin
Oh, it's not.
American.
There's no regional rotation here, is it?
There's no regional
For WTO.
Not officially.
No.
Okay.
But
there won't be a European, I'm pretty sure.
Anyway, I just wanted to remind everybody, as world trade is so very important, here is this very important organization, WTO, where we say that its current round of negotiations, which has been running for 12 years, is not successful, but its leadership is up for appointment for election, and no one is talking about it. Well, that will set the tone for where we are going. Yeah. Now, that was not the question which was asked, but you asked, your initial question was about the nature of the possible agreement, and could it change the equation in Asia? I really don't know, but I think that the way we are currently setting up the framework on the European side, which is very complex, just so that everybody knows, the European Union consists of 27 member states. It has an executive, and it has 27 parliaments, and it also has a European Parliament. Well, the mandate for these negotiations is the United States has been agreed in the European Commission, which is like the daily executive, is not been made public yet, because it will first go to 27 governments, and after that to 27 parliaments in one amended form orders, and then to the European Parliament for approval, and then we will start negotiating with you, which of course will be next week. But the idea on the European side is that we will be dealing largely with non-trade barriers, regulation, standards, quotas, in the hope that this way we will impact standards to be set in the multilateral trade negotiations. I said that in my introductory remarks. I think that is really in the back of the mind of the Europeans as the most important objective for these negotiations, and that will have its impact on Asian trade perspectives.
Okay, next question.
Yes, because you said in 2007 you instituted discussion of the TPP. And also in 2007 you instituted, it was called what was it called? But it was something about the new new trade policy for America. And I was wondering if that would be part of the TPP. And that was this policy about that involved labor standards. And do you know if that's going to be, because that would affect the TPP, I would think. Do you know if it's included?
That is a really good question. The part of the when I use the phrase 21st century trade agreement, I put my little fingers up here like this in quotes. I'm quoting the Obama administration's reference to 21st century trade issues. They include in that labor and environment. In fact, the first labor and environment provisions in trade agreements appeared in the original NAFTA, or as side letters to the original NAFTA deals. They were considered unsatisfactory by the environmental NGOs and the labor unions. In 2007, we, in this case the Bush administration, added to pending trade agreements with Panama, Colombia, Peru, and South Korea labor and environment, enforceable labor and environment provisions as part of what became known as quote, the May 10 agreement. It was an agreement that the Bush administration negotiated with the Democratic leadership in the Congress to get those free trade agreements through the Democratic Congress. And they set a bar. As it turned out, the Democratic Speaker of the House let the Peru trade agreement go through, and then she stopped the others. The other three went through under the Obama administration. They did not change the labor and environment provisions, which were, as you can imagine, a rather delicate balancing act between Republicans and Democrats, business and labor. My guess is, well, I know for a fact that there will be labor and environment provisions in, well, I can't say that. I'm not a negotiator. I'm not privy to, I will speculate that there will be labor and environment provisions in the TPP and in the TTIP, in the transatlantic agreement. The nature of those agreements, the nature of that language remains to be seen. I would speculate, however, that if the U.S. administration comes home with any language that is more stringent than what appeared in the last 4 U.S. free trade agreements, that they will have a very hard time getting those agreements through the Congress. If they come back with anything less than that, they'll have a hard time getting it through the Congress because the Democrats and the labor unions will object to it. I have read in newsletters that our trading partners in TPP are unhappy with the language in the existing trade agreements in the United States. So my understanding is those are still open issues subject to negotiation, and not my problem anymore.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question on TPP? What do you think, if you had to guess, what would Obama's administration's reaction be if China suddenly knocked on the door and says, can we join TPP?
That is just a brilliant question. That is really, I get questions from my Chinese friends all the time. Is this part of the pivot? Is this part of a containment strategy? First of all, there is no pivot and there is no containment strategy. Let's start with that.
There was a word called pivot, by the way.
Yeah, then they regret, from the moment they used the word, they regret having used the word. They don't use the word anymore. It's not a pivot. It's not containment. But yeah, that's a really good question. And I wouldn't even speculate, but I have no clue.
It is a very difficult question.
But I don't think there is any chance of that happening. So I don't think there's any chance of that happening. So I'm not sure I would worry about it. I think there's a lot of concern. Quite frankly, I think there's a lot of concern about China's implementation of its WTO commitments. And
For example?
intellectual property protection. Let's start with that. But I don't think that's likely to happen.
Yeah.
But at some point, I could see China joining the TPP. And when a major player comes into that kind of trade agreement, they don't just come in and say, "I'll take everything there." They're going to come in on their own terms. So.
Because if I give a rather distorted, simplistic view of the history of the sort of attitudes towards trade, I mean, 20, 30 years ago, China would have said, absolutely no way, I'm going to do free trade agreements. It means that the West will come in, exploit me, and so on and so forth. And they would have seen free trade agreements as basically a push by the West on China. But today, China is the world's largest exporter. It's become so competitive in many areas. Clearly, it is now in China's interest, actually,
But in fact,
to push for more trade
but
liberalization.
China is actually negotiating. China's part of the ASEAN Plus 3.
Yeah.
There's an RCEP
Yes, right.
negotiation going on. There is in fact a sectoral negotiation going on at the WTO. The WTO is not totally dead as a WTO. By the way, is vibrant as a dispute settlement body where disputes are being adjudicated. But there is a sectoral negotiation going on information technology products, and China just joined that. Obviously, they have a self-interest, but there's the best kind of trade negotiation is a trade negotiation where the parties are self-interested, and China is a party to that. So I think China takes a mature approach to this. China, I think the leadership in China recognizes that China has derived incredible benefits from its WTO membership.
Precisely. I mean, China has become the single biggest benefit. If you look at a chart of China's growth, it goes like this. And then 2003, after it joins WTO, it goes up like this,
Well, can you imagine, just imagine, what would have happened in 2008, 2009, and today, up through today, in terms of the kind of protectionism that China would have faced after 2008 if countries were not obligated to keep their tariffs against Chinese products bound at a certain level?
Absolutely.
So in many ways, that's how China has benefited from WTO tremendously.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I saw a hand somewhere at the back. Yes, please go ahead. One of our students, I believe.
Hi, my name is Harjo from Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Since the discussion has covered TPP, I'd like to ask a bit of a sensitive question on pharmaceutical companies or drugs issues. One of the most highlighted issues is TRIPS provision, and that's TRIPS plus provisions. And then one of the single biggest policy problems in Asia is healthcare. Like expensive drugs, to simplify it. It's just the biggest problem in Vietnam as well as in Indonesia. Some will argue it's in Singapore, but Singapore has a lot of other safety nets. And the argument goes that the TRIPS plus provision essentially create more monopoly power, creeping monopoly power for pharmaceutical companies that are US or Europe based, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, Pfizer. And so my question, what's your opinion that TPP, or probably to some extent RCEP later, but to PPP, some of the negotiated terms on TRIPS plus provision will affect this drugs prices? And honestly, most of these drugs are produced in US and Europe, and we import them. How would you see this affecting public health policy in Asia? Thank you.
Victor, do you want to answer that?
No.
No, he's Victor's a real gentleman. He said ladies first.
Frankly, I have no clue. It's just
It's very complicated, right?
No, it's a great question. It's a great issue. Let me start with the obvious disclaimer, which is because I'm not a negotiator and I'm not a what we call cleared advisor, I haven't seen the text. I haven't been a party to the negotiations, so I don't know what's in the text.
But you know the TRIPS plus agreement, you know, though.
I mean, the general issue, the access to medicines issue, is a really complicated issue, obviously, because on the one hand, and it's any intellectual property protection issue gets complicated, but there is no more complicated issue than the access to medicines issue, particularly when you're talking about developing countries, because you've got this balance between wanting to promote innovation and R&D, and you want pharmaceutical companies investing in new and better medicines, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you want individuals, particularly including individuals who don't have means,
Like in South Africa, for example.
to have access to those medicines.
HIV,
That's
HIV
right, to have
drugs,
access to those medicines. And then you have governments, and you've got governments with budgets, and you've got government health plans and health policies. And then you start getting into you get into a gray area, and you start getting into issues like compulsory licensing. And you have countries that arguably have resources to purchase brand name products that want to do it on the cheap. So it starts to get beyond my pay grade, I would argue, and happily...
There's no higher pay grade than USTR.
But happily it is not my, happily it's not something I'm involved in negotiating now, but it's going to be one of the, it is a tough thing to negotiate, and one of the most interesting and most challenging things about TPP is the fact that you really do have a continuum of development, development and of income levels involved in that negotiation. I mean, you think about per capita income in Singapore in the $40-some thousand range, and Vietnam much lower than that, as you noted, and still, if you are a citizen of Vietnam, you want the pharmaceutical companies to be innovating, and you want them to be doing that R&D. So what is the balance so that there is enough protection in the patent system such that that innovation will continue, and yet you as a citizen will have access to that medicine? And I don't know what the answer is, and I wish the negotiators all the luck in the world in finding, in finding what that fine line is.
Victor, you want to add something on pharmaceuticals? No. Okay. I think we have time for one or two more questions, quick ones. Yes, please. Again, identify yourself for them. Yeah.
Hi, name is Lionel. I'm an MPA student here. My question is, given that the TPP is really been negotiating outside of the WTO, does this compromise the image or the future of the WTO?
No, it doesn't. We have had regional free trade agreements for many decades. They have been flourishing for the past 2-3 decades, even while we were concluding the Uruguay round. And all of this will ultimately potentially lead up to one multilateral round, though multilateral negotiations are becoming more complex as there are less dominating partners than in the past. But I think that in the interim, all these regional free trade agreements, be it in the Pacific or the Atlantic or inside Europe or in Latin America and in between regions, are only very, very helpful and do not delegitimize the WTO. The WTO, and Ambassador Schwab can explain this better than I do, the WTO has various roles. One of them is to bring the system further, that is liberalized trade, and the other one is dispute settlement, which is really, really very important. Not very sexy, but very important.
I'm going to end with a difficult question to both of you. It's about the dog that didn't bark question. Because I remember after 2008, 2009, the financial crisis, I met Pascal Lamy. He was actually genuinely worried at the height of the crisis that countries would retreat into protectionism because, that people would get frightened, jobs were being lost, and protectionism would rise. And it's actually quite surprising how little protectionism there has been in the last 4 or 5 years. How do you explain that? Why are countries still committed to preserving the sort of trade agreements and trade rules that they committed themselves to? That's surprising. Why wasn't there a backsliding towards protectionism as in the Great Depression in the 1930s? What's the reason for that?
A couple things. WTO works. It's a set of rules, and countries decided to abide by them. I think the G8 meeting that took place in November of 2008, G20 meeting that took place, with one of the things that they put, it was the first G20 meeting, they put in a pledge to not undertake any discriminatory trade and investment initiatives, and started to monitor that. I think that had an impact when it was most important that happened. So I think that's first and foremost. Second, the interdependence of, and this goes to global supply chains, but there is a lot of global interdependence today, and it's very hard to take a protectionist action against somebody else and not hurt yourself at the same time. You discover that when you try to come up with retaliation lists, when you're trying to retaliate against another country, when you're allowed to retaliate under the WTO, you find it's really hard to do that, raise a tariff against somebody else without actually hurting yourself. So I think those are two examples. Let me disagree with you, however, in the following way. There has been an uptick of protectionism in two ways. Depending on how you count it, I think maybe 4% of global trade has been impacted. There's a very interesting website that tracks these things, globaltradealerts.org, I think, out of Geneva. And some traditional trade tools like anti-dumping have been used, and I would argue abused by countries. China has been a big victim. Emerging economies have been using these trade tools against each other to unprecedented degree. And the other thing is, because the multilateral trading system hasn't been upgraded since 1993, there's a lot of protectionism in the gaps in the multilateral trading system, forced localization, intellectual property areas, investment-related, services-related protectionism. None of that gets measured because it's all consistent with the WTO, or some of it is consistent with the WTO, but it's still protectionism.
Victor?
Why no protectionism since 2008, 2009? I think that the world is pretty convinced that unilateralism doesn't work. It's much easier to demonstrate that multilateral or regional agreements are good for everyone than it is to prove that protectionism, unilateralism, has any serious positive impact. And so as a consequence, for instance, in Europe, even in these countries which have been in difficulties over the past 3-4 years in the southern part of the European Union, the call for protectionism or some kind of protectionist measures has been limited to what I would call the cranks on either side of the political landscape.
Great. Well, I think you'll all agree that we've had quite an interesting, complex discussion on the issues of international trade. I learned a lot, and I'm sure you all learned a lot. So please join me in thanking our two distinguished panelists, Susan and Victor.